Alright, so I'm going to demonstrate some techniques for working with watercolor. First off, let's learn a little bit about watercolor. Watercolor is a pigment that you can use to apply color to your drawings. So there's a pigment. What makes it flow is a little bit of water content, and what binds the pigment to the page and kind of suspends it in the liquid is a binder called gum arabic. Gum arabic, you can see it here without any pigment, is a refined tree sap, and it kind of will dry gummy to fully hard, but is water soluble always. And so that's why you can take watercolor from a liquid state or from a solid state, like you see in kind of a pan watercolor, to a liquid that you can apply to your paper. I'm going to be demonstrating the kind of watercolors that I have readily available for shared use in our classroom, and that's a liquid watercolor. They come in these little sort of inkwell type droppers. This brand, Ecoline, is highly pigmented, which I like, but mostly I have it because it's easily shareable. They're easy to open, easy to close. You get a lot of bang for your buck. If you're going to buy your own watercolors, you might choose a portable sort of cake type watercolor. That's kind of what you might have worked with when you're a kid. Here is a kind of more adult version. So with a cake style watercolor, the gum arabic gets to sort of air dry into a hardened state, but when you're ready to use these watercolors, you simply hydrate them by adding a little bit of water, and then you're able to apply them to your paper. What's nice is you can leave them out to air dry, and then they become quite portable. You're also able to sort of take just a little bit of the pigment at a time, which is nice, and so they'll last a long time for individual use. Some of the highest quality watercolors are actually, you'll find them in a tube. When we squirt them out, the binder this time isn't fully hardened. Well, maybe it isn't here. That's why we don't usually have them in our class. Let's see if this one will. But if they're in a good state, they come out kind of pasty. You could apply them in that form. One thing to know, though, is that part of watercolor's permanence is the amount that absorbs into the paper. So to get a bit more absorption, you may want to add a little bit more water content to that paste watercolor, and you can see it applies quite nicely. Like I said, what I'll mostly be demoing today is these Ecoline Inkwell liquid watercolors. I'm going to set up and so they have a little dropper, and we can just drop them into a palette here. I'm going to set up my palette quite strategically. I've organized both the order of the watercolor, and I'll organize them on my palette, so I'm sort of working with adjacent relationships on the color wheel. So I'm going to have a blue here, then I'll go ahead and I'll skip just one inkwell, so I leave some room for some mixing, which can be kind of interesting. Pull in a purple, which gets just a little warmer. Lay in a magenta. Actually, well, we can go to orange, but I don't know if I'll use it. I actually think I might skip this one. I'll go to green here. And yellow here. I kind of disrupted my plan by squirting my orange watercolor in there. So you can kind of see we go from blue to purple to magenta to yellow to green. So we go from our coolest to our warmest and then start cooling again. Ignore that little orange in there. All right. As soon as you put your pour out your first watercolors, what you should do is just see what the pigments look like when they're really saturated. So what I'm going to do, it's always good to have sort of a test paper next to your watercolor process, because you'll see when the pigments are concentrated in their liquid state, it's kind of hard to see what color you're going to get. So first I'm applying just a little bit of that blue straight out of the bottle. This shows me how concentrated that blue can be. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean off my brush with a little bit of water. Another thing you'll always want to have ready is an absorbent paper towel. We'll use it just for cleaning the brush, but also for other elements of our watercolor process later. Then I'm just going to take a little water. While my pigment is still kind of wet on the paper, I'm going to touch that wet brush into the pigment on the paper and start pulling it down just to see how I can get the color to desaturate and kind of lighten by pulling that pigment down. So that starts showing me the saturation or value range of each color. So there's my blue. Here's my purple in concentration. It's more of a cobalt or periwinkle, but. And then I'm going to pull it down just by adding a little bit of clean water. See it sort of desaturate. See how the color changes. And I have 1 cup that I'm washing my brush in and 1 cup that I'm only dipping my clean brush in to sort of keep my colors as saturated as possible. My magenta is super bright. Wash my brush off. And just pull that color down so I can see how it desaturates. And so that's kind of going to be your first move. After you mix colors, after you just pour out of the tube, have a test sheet ready so you can just build some expectations of what your color is going to do and make sure you like it. All right? Something to know about color pigments. In order to get those colors, they're sourced from many different materials. In the same set of pigments, you may have colors that are sourced from different minerals, different organic matters, some different kinds of plants. Also potentially, very much complex chemical process could bring together a particular kind of pigment. And that's just sort of how they source the color. But because the pigments are sourced from different places, they can behave really differently. They can have different opacities, different translucencies. So another thing to kind of be playing with on your test sheet is once these are dried, it can be a good idea to also sort of take a pigment and see how it overlaps another pigment. That may still have been a little wet to test that, but you can sort of see how strong that pigment is, how saturated it is, and how opaque or translucent it is by layering and overlapping pigments over one another. Also can be smart to overlap them over a black pigment. All right. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate wet on wet techniques, which are what I used to create the sky and the grass in this illustration. So water is our carrier for our pigment in a watercolor process. What makes it permanent is the water eventually either evaporates and also absorbs into the surface of a watercolor paper. And as it absorbs into that paper, the pigment gets drawn into the fibers of the paper as well, which kind of makes it stuck in those fibers and permanent on the page. But why I'm telling you this is, it's important to know that the watercolor really only will go where and exist where water is, and only stay permanent where water has been. So on a wet on wet process, the first thing you do after sort of claiming with a pencil line, a light pencil line, the area that you want to apply the watercolor. For the sky, what I did was I set up a space for a wash application by just, with a large brush and a small brush, applying a layer of just water without pigment. So now this whole upper area of the drawing has been saturated. There's kind of a layer of water just sitting on the surface. Now what I'm going to be doing is just kind of starting to apply pigment to that surface. And you can see that it sort of pulls and bleeds as the pigment floats across the surface of the water on the page. You can see if I put the same pigment on a dry page, it stays much more tightly in the line I applied it. But when I put it on a wet page, that color really starts moving in unpredictable ways. This can be something that really frustrates people with watercolor, but when planned and sort of harnessed intentionally, it can become a really interesting effect. So now I'm going to start doing a little mixing on my palette. I've sort of set up an adjacent sort of color wheel so that I can just grab pigments from right beside one another. To expand my palette, create some intermediate color relationships that I can also be applying. So as I said, pigments can be really vary in terms of their translucency and opacity, but in a watercolor, because the binder is so transparent, and water is obviously quite transparent as well, you're going to get more translucency in a pigment than in some other kinds of paint or color materials. And with that translucency, it sometimes requires a bit more planning, because as you move sort of further away from each color on the color wheel, the distinction of those colors, when they start overlapping and bleeding, can neutralize your vibrancy of color really fast. You can end up getting your kind of chromatic neutral grays, or what people kind of, in terms of watercolor, what they describe as muddy color, which is something that people really dislike and fear with this media quite often. So working with colors that sort of sit more adjacently on a color wheel, especially if you're working wet and wet, can be really smart. You can see that I'm getting the colors to mix with one another right on the surface through that process of having that wet application where they bleed. I can also sort of, as it's still wet, direct that process a bit more specifically. Another thing is, while you're working wet on wet, while that surface is wet, you can also do some blotting to lift some of your pigment right off the surface of the paper. It's sort of in the media kind of like your undo button. So as long as I've still close to wet, I can rehydrate and lift a lot of that material if I decide it's not moving in a way I want it to, not behaving. But let me get down to kind of the magic part. I got to make sure that my surfaces are still hydrated here, but I left this little shirt kind of floating out in the wind, literally. And I've kept that area very dry because I wanted to be able to demonstrate for you just how intentionally you can stop the flow and that bleeding of the watercolor based on where you've placed just the water wash and where you haven't. So you can see I'm reaching right up to that edge and I'm getting a pretty particular line. You can even make that tighter. And the flow of the pigment will stop bleeding right where my application of water has stopped. So my mountain edges stay visible, the edge of that shirt starts appearing. Get right into the collar here. And so even in this much more kind of spontaneous application, with some thoughtful planning, I can exert some careful control.